He thought I'd never leave. He thought my silence was permanent. He was wrong. The divorce papers are still stamped in my wallet. The ink a small practical victory I keep touching with the edge of my thumb when doubt creeps in. And after all that, after the nights of excuses and the mornings of finding lipstick on shirts I pretended not to notice, I married a billionaire. It sounds like the kind of headline that demands a gasp or a sneer. I get both, sometimes in the same breath. But there's a truth under the sensationalism that I need you to hear. I didn't leave because I wanted a richer life. I left because I wanted the one I had been living in my head since I was a teenager, the one where nobody called my absence loyalty and forgave my erosion into quiet. When Jim and I met, I was 23 and still believed that chemistry could rearrange stubborn things. He had a laugh that filled a room and a way of looking at me that convinced me for a while that the world could be narrowed down to two people. He sold software with charm and the kind of ambition that smells like new money and late flights. I sold elegance. I modeled hands, nail campaigns, jewelry close-ups, the little public pieces of me that strangers loved and clients paid for. It was an odd economy of intimacy. My hands, his promises. The first year of marriage was a balancing act. Jim's promotions meant dinners rescheduled, hotel rooms that smelled faintly of other people's cologne, and the occasional apology that tasted like the end of a speech. He'd say, "This meeting will be the last one that pulls me away," as if I were an object to be recalibrated. And each time he returned home with an excuse, I found myself rearranging expectations like shifting furniture in a room I couldn't leave. At dinners, I learned to eat while he answered emails. At night, I learned to sleep first and wonder later. It was the small things that started to erode me. Missed anniversaries, a failure to notice the way my father's hair was going thin, the absence at my grandfather's 70th when he needed someone to hold his hand. The larger things came later. The messages, the evasive phone calls, the late-night deliveries of things he wouldn't tell me about. When I finally confronted him, his face did something I hadn't seen in months. It went smooth, practiced. "We're not that couple," he said, which was a kind of refusal dressed up as truth. The last straw wasn't dramatic, not by movie standards. There was no explosive scene where everything snapped. There was only a long, thin thread of ignoring. He was promoted to regional sales manager and moved the office 2 states away. He called on weekends and sometimes not at all. One spring afternoon, sitting at my kitchen table with a takeout container and a contract for a theater audition open on my laptop, I realized I had been learning to live inside a gap. I realized I could do the work I loved anywhere, and maybe, for the first time in years, I could do it without pretending his absence was safety. The divorce was quieter than the marriage had been noisy. We sat across from each other at a lawyer's table, and I watched his mouth form words as if the shape of them were part of a script he no longer felt. He had the gall to look surprised when I asked for custody of nothing, for no alimony, for the bare minimum of my dignity, my name on everything, my freedom to decide what came next. He signed. I signed. The courthouse stamped a kind of finality on the day. The little rectangle of ink that felt like a door closing, and a small glorious new crack opening in the wall of my life. If you'd like to hear exactly how it unfolded, stay with me. Leaving Jim didn't mean the world became gentler. In many ways it hardened. A week after the papers were final, my grandfather called me into his study. He had been the kind of man who kept his hands busy, fixing watches, pruning bonsai, telling me the stories he liked better than the ones we lived. He loved me with a stubborn, practical tenderness. He also loved the family name and the idea of its continuity. He told me gently that his health wasn't what it used to be and that my father was worried about the company shares he'd promised me. "There's a clause," my father said over the phone later that day, the sentence clipped and businesslike. "The shares are conditional. They're for you, but only if there is a grandchild within a year." That clause felt like a countdown clock being installed inside my ribcage. It wasn't merely about money. It was about legacy, and about a family imagining itself as unbroken if the biological signal of continuity was present. It was about a father who preferred a ledger to a conversation, and a grandfather who wanted a name to pass to a child. None of them knew, and none of them guessed, the way I had been rebuilding myself since the stamp on the divorce papers dried. I considered adoption, legal maneuvers, postponing and arguing. I spoke to a lawyer. I calculated. Then I got an offer that complicated the calculus. A man I barely knew stepped into the equation with an offer so improbable it could only be the plot of someone else's life. His name was Lan Doll in the whisperings of other people's mouths, but I would later learn his legal last name, the one people used in print when they called him a titan. For now, he was the man in the bar who watched me argue over splitting a tab I shouldn't have missed. I had gone out that night because I wanted to feel less like a phone whose battery slowly died, and more like a person who could laugh without having to justify the sound. It was one of those evenings where the world feels slightly excessive. People in bold coats, laughter spilling over, a band that sounded like it was trying to be famous. I was not famous. I was a woman who had spent 5 years carefully crafting photographed hands, and who, at the moment of the misunderstanding, had more on her mind than a forgotten glass. A wallet fell from a stranger's pocket near my table. Someone accused me of taking it. The accusation was the kind of humiliation that feels both ancient and oddly modern. A clip on a phone, a whispered, "She did it?" and a smirk that tastes like judgment. The bar wanted me to pay for the missing credit card's temporary hold. The bartender wanted me to leave my ID. I argued clumsily because arguing is an old method of trying to be seen. At some point, a man's voice cut in, calm, controlled, the kind of voice that didn't need to front with volume. "She didn't take it," he said. I looked up to find Lon, hands in his coat pockets, eyes like a winter sky, cool and oddly bright. He paid the tab when I hesitated, his credit card sliding across the counter like an offer. He didn't ask for anything then, but he did watch me in a way that suggested he was not merely observing a stranger. He offered me a ride home when the taxi app glitched. I refused until I remembered I wanted to feel less alone. He was not what you expect billionaires to be. No ostentatious watches, no lapel pins that announced him. He had the kind of reserve that made other people explain themselves to him. The encounter could have ended there, a borrowed favor, a story to laugh about. Instead, a week later, I found a note on my phone that read, "We need to talk." It was his number attached. His message was concise. I saw how the story spread. "You might not want it attached to your name. I can help. Call me." Help could mean any number of things. For Lan, help had an architecture. His company was large, influence crooked like the branches of some evergreen, and he had reasons to avoid scandal. The rumor mill of our city had a habit of attaching itself to anyone who made a small mistake. For me, the implication of help was more immediate. Protection from gossip that could cost me the small, fragile chances at the stage I'd begun to crave. We met in a coffee shop that smelled like espresso and new paperbacks. He wore a coat that kept him warm even when I could feel the draft through the window. He was direct. "I can stop the narrative," he said, "but it will cost you?" I heard the word cost and braced for humiliation. He didn't demand money. He proposed something colder and stranger, a contract. We would pose as a married couple for a time, publicly. It would shield him from his own rumors and shield me from mine. For my part, I would receive compensation, legal protection should the company try anything, and leverage in the negotiations with my father. For him, a semblance of stability, a photograph of a man who was anchored, a name he could show the press if he needed to deflect something worse. His proposal, in the abstract, looked like a pragmatic trade, reputation for protection, illusion for safety. He handed me the number of his lawyer and a summary of terms that tried to look more like a business memo than a life decision. "You'll have my protection on record," he said. "You keep your independence. It's temporary, until the storm passes." There was a blackmail undertone, an unspoken agree or face being unmade in the papers. But Lon never weaponized it with malice. He presented the arrangement as a strategy that served both of us. You could call it leverage. You could call it a bargain between two people who had different kinds of currency. I called it a possibility. I weighed the options as if they were choices on a ledger. Grandfather's claws blinked like a countdown. My career needed breathing space. The rumor could choke it. The contract would buy me time, funds to audition, and, most importantly, an ally who could keep me from being gaslit by the public. I signed on because I am, at my core, a calculator of survival. I am not ashamed of that choice. To survive sometimes requires trades you cannot fully explain to people who have never been hungry for a moment of peace. We said "I do" in a courthouse whose lights were too bright for the smallness of the vows. The ceremony was a few exchanged lines, the clink of a pen, an official stamp. I remember the smell of the building, old paper and air conditioning, and the surprising steadiness in Lan's hand when he took mine. It was, legally, an agreement. It was also the first time in months someone looked at me like they intended not to let me disappear. From the outside, the contract marriage was a neat piece of theater. The press reframed our meeting as a romance. The gossip columns passed our smiles. Privately, the arrangement came with rules. No forced intimacy, no claims of ownership, a clear end date written into the agreement. He paid what was promised, upfront funds, access to a lawyer who read like an armor, an office name that could be used when the company's PR needed a human face. For a woman who had been taught to hide while the world rearranged itself around men, it felt like standing on a new shore with a life preserver within reach. But illusion is a politics of its own, and the office is a low-grade war. The minute my name attached to his, colleagues who had nothing to lose and everything to gossip about took their positions. Whispers multiplied. A pink diamond watch became a story. The watch had been a prop at a corporate unveiling, glittering, small, meant to be photographed on a public figure. Someone left it on my desk as a joke, and a video looped through private channels edited like a trap. Zoe caught with a lavish gift, smiling, the implication being that I had accepted something unbecoming for a woman of my supposed integrity. It doesn't matter whether the watch belonged to me in actuality. The image was enough. People invented narratives without evidence. I found myself in the center of an argument I had not wanted, accused of benefiting from gifts I had not solicited. HR calls were polite and pointed. A few clients asked for reassurances in tones that promised to take their accounts elsewhere if the story didn't stop. My PR, such as it was suddenly more important than my paycheck. It was the first time I truly understood how precarious reputation could be for a woman who had built a career on a part of herself, my hands, that people admired but never considered to be whole. The watch was verified the next day. A stolen prop, misattributed. Someone had tried to use it as ammunition. Lon could have let it go. Instead, he responded the way people with influence sometimes do. He called a small press statement crisp and unavoidable. My partner has been falsely implicated in a slanderous item, his publicist said. We have evidence and we will pursue it. The language was clinical. The effect was that it shifted the conversation from me to those who'd started it. There was gratitude, sharp and complicated, because his intervention was necessary, and because it landed him in the story in a way that made me feel indebted. He bought me a buffer I could use to audition without the net of gossip getting wider. But the aid didn't erase my memory of how easy it had been for my name to be dragged into the mud. It made me more careful and less innocent. I started to audition again, not for glossy ads, but for roles with depth. The theater had always been a secret longing. As a child, I had watched the actors on the Old Town stage and felt a tug in my chest that was nearly physical. An urge to show and be larger than the framed photographs of my own hands. The fake marriage, for all its artifice, bought me the months I needed to take rehearsals during the day without having to explain my absences or justify my time. The first casting director who called me back, I remember sitting on the edge of a bench outside a rehearsal studio, my breath visible in the air because it was the sort of long, unremarkable New York morning that makes you feel like anything might start. The part was small by most standards but vital to the piece. A woman who carried a quiet anger and a soft resilience. The director's voice was blunt. "You have hands I can work with," she said, and my smile was more like a release. Rehearsals were brutal and intoxicating. There were nights when my feet ached, lines tangled in my mouth, and I wanted to give up because it was so painfully human to be imperfect. Lan would appear in the doorway sometimes, always after rehearsals, sometimes just standing at the back of the empty theater like a sentinel. He never came into the dressing room uninvited. He brought soup once, in a thermos, and left it on the step with a note. "For the body that puts up with the rest." The note felt like an offering neither of guilt nor of expectation. It was a small kindness that had weight. Work became a battleground that paradoxically made me feel alive. There were moments of humiliation, a whispered rumor in the corridor, a producer who once dismissed me as a model dabbling, and moments of soaring applause when I finally found a line that made an audience breathe differently. The theater became my clinic of repair. My hands, once photographed for product stills, now played the gestures of people with histories and pains. The applause felt like an honest currency. It never tried to own me. Not everything went smoothly. The company boardroom still had people who resented my presence or sensed advantage in my downfall. Jim's name would surface from time to time in messages that read more like threats than memories. Veiled claims about my decisions while we were married, questions about loyalty and fairness. I always thought of those messages as the ruins of something that had once been built carefully and with intention, now crumbling because someone had stopped tending to the foundations. Lan tried to keep me shielded, but protection has limits. There were nights I drove myself home from rehearsals thinking about what the future might demand. Would I have to choose between a role and a rumor? Between a child's name and a contract clause? The math of my life kept changing, and I kept adding, subtracting, trying to hold the numbers steady until I could be sure of what I wanted. It was a different kind of pressure than the marriage had been. In the marriage, pressure was exerted against me by a man who believed my silence meant acceptance. In the contract, pressure was external, boardrooms, cameras, a family ledger. But the fear was the same, being made small in a world that profits on spectacle. I was learning to respond differently. And then, when the theater was finally putting me in a part that felt like reclamation, a new and sharp pivot slid into my life. It was not a dramatic entrance. It began with a phone call that made my stomach drop. The voice on the other end belonged to the clinic where I'd had a routine exam months earlier. The woman speaking used a professional tone that made the words feel slower. "We need you to come in," she said. "There are some results we have to discuss in person." I hung up, feeling the world tilt, as if the stage had become a ship listing to one side. There were a dozen possible explanations, nothing was certain, but something in the way the receptionist said the word results felt like a door that had been closed one minute and would be slammed open in the next. I had thought the worst was behind me. I had thought that, with the courthouse stamp and the theater's velvet curtains and Lan's quiet care, I had escaped the worst of the public's appetite for my private life. It turned out that new dangers can take the shape of other people's expectations, and sometimes they begin with a phone call that smells like rain. The room on the other end of the line was papered in the same soft light I had come to like in dressing rooms, warm, forgiving. I told the receptionist I'd be there in 20 minutes. I rehearsed my face as if it were a role, the way actors rehearse a smile until it feels authentic. The theater's script lay open on my kitchen counter. The divorce papers were folded into the glove compartment of my car. My grandfather's call echoing in my mind like a metronome. "You must think of the future." I drove through a city that felt both familiar and laced with new anxiety. The hospital looked smaller from the outside, like a set someone had cut to scale. I walked in with my clutch under my arm, and the scent of the soup Lan had left in my coat pocket still warm against my skin. I told myself I would get a brief click and close. Nothing, or something that required nothing more than a decision I could make on my own. But inside, there were already people who had started to assemble the outlines of the next chapter in my life. My family with its ledger, my ex with his half-smile, Lan with his offer that felt like permission and like a fence. I could feel the story tightening around me, and I knew that whether I wanted to or not, I had stepped into a place where choices would be measured against expectations I had not set. When the nurse called my name, the hallway looked like private and public had collided. The room seemed small, and my hands that had built a career out of being admired, felt suddenly foreign to me. I sat down, because sitting is a simple act that reminds you exist, and I looked at the nurse who had the kind of practiced sympathy that tells truth without spectacle. "There's a positive result," she said quietly, her pen hovering as if it hesitated to mark a line that would change everything. "We need to do a follow-up scan." I breathed in, and air met me like a cold truth. I had 100 scenarios running in my head, scenarios that involved choices and consequences that would echo into the next year and beyond. A child in my future would alter the ledger my father kept, and it would entwine with the clause my grandfather had mentioned. It would recalibrate more than our family's shares. It would recalibrate who I could be and who would claim me. I called my grandfather on the way home because when an alert rings inside you, the people who gave you roots are the ones you reach for. He answered on the first ring, a small crack in his voice that told me he'd been waiting to hear. "Whatever you decide," he said, "do it for you. Do not do it because anyone else asked you to." Even as he said it, I felt the grammar of my life shifting. There were legalities to consider, possibilities to weigh, and a set of people who would try to tell me what to do. The phone hummed with messages. Lon's name lit my screen. My father's call went unanswered. Jim's text read like a stone rolled across the path. "Are you sure?" And the city outside kept moving with the indifferent rhythm of a world that needed no permission to go on. I sat on the couch in the half-light of my living room, the theater script open, and the divorce papers folded in my bag. My hands lay on my knees, a thing of muscle and habit. They had helped me model, rehearse, act, and sign. They had also steadied me when I needed to leave. In the quiet, I realized that decisions had a gravity that was neither dramatic nor easy. They were worn like a necklace, small, continuous, and sometimes heavy. I was 25 days along, though I didn't know the number yet, and the thought of it made my throat close. The choices ahead would not be merely personal, they would be watched, parsed, and judged. Jim would see them as an opportunity to wound. My family would measure them against a legacy. Lan would see them as one more reason to guard me. But in the hush of that evening, between the echo of my grandfather's advice and the draft from the window, I felt a stubborn pulse of something like hope. The future was asking me to choose, and for the first time since the stamp dried on that courthouse paper, I felt the possibility of choosing on my own terms. I slept poorly that night, as if my body were keeping vigil for something it couldn't yet name. The next morning, the world looked the way it always did. Busy, unsuspecting, but inside me something had begun to rearrange. I rehearsed my lines, answered emails, and went to rehearsals. Lan sent a text that read simply, "Thinking of you, no demands, no instructions, a small constellation of care." I thought, briefly, that the worst of my troubles had been the marriage, the invisibility, the neglect, the small deaths of attention. But the world has a way of testing you after you think you have passed. Not all tests are cruel. Some are invitations. The phone call from the clinic was one of them. As I walked into the theater that night for a run-through, lights dimmed and the smell of dust and paint hit me like the memory of an old friend. I felt steadier on stage than I had in months. The scene required me to stand amid a crowd and speak truth. I did it, and when the applause came at the end of the run, it didn't feel like applause for a role. It felt like the sound of a thing repaired. Backstage, I sat under a single lamp, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold. My phone buzzed against my thigh. I read the unknown number without recognition. It was the clinic, calling again. My heart pitched. "Hello," I whispered into the dark, because there are moments when you need to keep your voice small. "We have your follow-up," the voice on the line said. "Please come in first thing tomorrow. There are some implications you should discuss in person." I closed my eyes, and the theater around me blurred into a shape of light and shadow. I thought of Jim, who had believed my staying was certain. I thought of my grandfather, who wanted a name to carry on. I thought of Lon, who had placed a thermos of soup on the theater steps like an offering without strings. The world wanted to tell a story about me. I wanted to tell one back. But the next chapter had not yet been written, and in the gap between the clinic's line and the clinic's door I felt, for the first time in a long time, the rawness of a life that belonged to me. The choices would come, and when they did, they would not be made in public headlines. They would be made in a small private place where my hands, calloused on the knuckles from rehearsals, smoothed from the years of modeling, capable of both signing papers and holding a child, would be the ones to decide. Just when I thought the worst was over, the hospital called. The nurse's words had barely left the hallway when my phone lit up again. This time it was Jim. His name on the screen felt like sandpaper on a wound I'd only just begun to scab over. He texted, "You sure you want this? Think about what it will do. Don't let them make you reckless." I put the phone down and told myself to breathe. Then I told myself the truth. I did not owe him a decision, and I did not owe an explanation. But threats have a way of rearranging a room. They make you sit straighter. They make you notice exits. They make you call people. I called my grandfather first. He answered with the same small crack in his voice. "Whatever you decide," he said again, as if repetition could turn his sentence into armor for me. He did not ask for details. He did not pressure me toward a ledger. He said, "Come by, tea and the bonsai bench?" Lan texted a line of 3 words that felt like a hand on my shoulder. "I'm here." Then, because his reserve was more useful in a crisis than platitudes, he sent the number of his lawyer and a promise. "Come to my office tomorrow if you want security measures in place." I went to the clinic the next morning with a theater schedule in the pocket of my coat and a list of questions flattened by the weight of other people's expectations. The ultrasound technician was courteous and professional. The screen was small and bright, the shapes on it less like a story and more like an instruction manual to the future. The tech murmured words I had been rehearsing silently. Gestational sac. Heartbeat present. 25 days was an estimate, but the numbers lined up in a way that left no room for rationalizing this as anything but real. When the doctor sat across from me afterward, he did not look at my phone, he looked at me. "You have options," he said, calm and clinical. "Whatever you choose, we'll support you medically. There are specifics we'll discuss." The specificity of the medical world felt steadying. It gave me a list I could hold and consider. I left the clinic with the ultrasound picture folded into my wallet like contraband, like a ticket to an evening that would change my life. I called my father because the ledger he guarded was a fact of our world, and because avoidance would only let others fill the silence, he answered on the second ring, businesslike as ever. "We should talk about the shares," he said. "If you want them, we need to meet." I wanted to hang up. Instead, I said, "I want to be the one to decide whether I have this child." There was a pause, a pocket of white noise you hear when someone is thinking about what their choices mean. "This family has traditions," he finally said. "There are expectations. You should consider them." I thought of my grandfather's hands on the bonsai branches and the way he would look at me when I spoke about a part of myself he understood. I thought about the small ledger he kept in an upstairs drawer. The numbers there were not just figures. They were his map of how he imagined his life continued. I love him for wanting a place in the future. I also loved him enough to keep a secret part of my decisions for myself. The paternity question came like a shadow in daylight. Jim could be the father. So could someone else. An incident from months prior blurred by distance and regret. I sat with the facts and the possible consequences. DNA could reveal the truth later. It would not dictate what I did now. For the first time since the divorce papers had dried, I felt something like permission to be the one to set the terms. But permission in isolation is fragile. Threats are best when they have someone behind them, when a hand keeps them turning toward you. Jim, perhaps sensing leverage, turned cruel in a way that belonged to men who believed their will was a right. His messages escalated from coy questions to accusations to outright demands. "You made a mistake," he typed. "Fix it," he implied ruin. The language of the old marriage, of ownership disguised as concern, cropped up in new ways. One evening, after a rehearsal that had left me raw and humming and late, I found a voicemail that made my throat close. His voice was low and steady in the way men use when they mean to intimidate without spectacle. "We need to talk in person," he said. "No lawyers, no cameras." He made it sound matter-of-fact, like arranging coffee, which is sometimes what fear looks like when it is bearded by denial. I called his bluff. I told him I'd meet in a cafe near my apartment where there were cameras and people and witnesses, small things that make men used to control feel watched. He didn't like that. His next message demanded I come alone to a hotel he booked for privacy. He sent location pins, times, and then, when I didn't reply, a stream of increasingly bitter texts that read like the pages of someone panicking. I called the non-emergency number and asked for advice. They suggested documentation. I saved his messages. I told a friend at work, Dana, who gave me the kind of practical comfort the rehearsal room had taught me to give others. "Take someone. Don't go by yourself." I told Lan, who then asked if he could come with me. I thanked him and said no. If I wanted to face Jim on my own terms, I wanted to do it alone. That decision felt like a test of the self I'd been rebuilding. It was also, looking back, naive. The hotel room was dim when I entered. Jim was already there. The lid of his control snapped back into place under his smile. He stood by the window, hands tucked into the pockets of a suit that had traveled. "You shouldn't have signed away the easy options," he said, and when I didn't let him steer the conversation with old guilt, he stepped closer in a way that eliminated exits. "My decision isn't yours to make," I said, and in those words I felt my throat burn with the old small fury I had kept alive through the divorce. "You cannot call my life yours by default." He put a hand on my arm, not a gentle hand, not an apology, a hand that was a reminder of how he used to claim me. He said, "I can make this go away. There are places, Zoe, people who fix things. If you do what I say, if you end this." He tapped his temple in a gesture that was meant to suggest inevitability. "Things will go back to what they were." I felt the history of our marriage, of being discounted into a ledger, bend itself around the moment, the part of me trained to survive calculated exits. I slipped my hand out and took a step back. He moved like an animal that didn't want a door to close. The conversation grew harder. He tried to persuade me with claims and manipulations. You owe it to us, to your family, to your future. He used our past as a bargaining chip. When he reached for my phone to take it from me, an ugly, clumsy move meant to silence any possible record, I reacted with the reflex of someone who had learned to protect herself. I grabbed back. Our hands met in a tangle. He pushed. I stepped away and his hand hit my arm hard enough to sting. It was not cinematic. It was a bruise the size of a small truth. I told him to leave. He did not. He stood in the doorway like a warning. I left and called the police from the sidewalk. They came with the flatness of people who see repeated versions of these scenes every day. I filed a report for assault and threatening behavior. The officer advised me on the steps to request a protective order. I typed out the messages into a document and sent them to an email address the officer gave me. I felt, the way victims do when they do the right thing, more exhausted than relieved. Jim threatened reprisals. He said he could make a scandal of me in ways no one would believe. He said things meant to resurrect his power in a world where his promotions had once mattered more than my hours at the theater. He walked a line between quiet threats and the blatant. The law can be slow and threats can be fast. I learned to hold both. Lan learned of the incident almost immediately. He did the things men with power do. He arranged lawyers and an incident team and a series of measures that felt to me equal parts necessary and uncomfortable. He called and asked questions in a voice that had by now moved beyond reserve. There was steel in it. "Tell me everything," he said. When I hesitated at the image of my life being narrated to someone who could make things go away, he said simply, "You decide what you want me to do." He did not act like someone who would silence me in the name of protection. He acted like someone who would bolster the choices I already showed signs of making. He offered security, legal muscle, and resources. I accepted. I also insisted on being included in the decisions. He respected that. The difference between control and support matters. It would matter a lot later on. The police recommend a temporary restraining order. I filed it with the documents I had, texts, voicemails, the report. The legal work felt bureaucratic and momentous at once. My theater rehearsals continued in the interstices. People at work whispered. Some of them looked at me with something like pity. Others looked with suspicion, as if my bravery had made me a spectacle rather than a woman put under duress. It was infuriating and exhausting and yet oddly clarifying. I had few illusions about applause. The world always has other stories to tell. Jim's strategy shifted from intimidation to smear. He began to leak parts of our previous life in hints and rumors. Claims that I had been opportunistic, suggestions that my relationships were transactional. The boardroom was a place of rumor now, with people parsing the new story for advantage. I responded the way I had learned to do things. I spoke my truth where it mattered. On the record, through my lawyer, and in the theater where my work could be seen for what it was, not what it was conveniently explained to be. Lan did something that surprised me. He put himself out there in a way he had not before. At first it was small, publicizing a statement that made it clear he stood behind me, that our relationship as arranged was contractual, and that any insinuation of impropriety was false. Then, as Jim escalated his attacks, going to reporters with hints that sounded like threats, Lan called a press meeting. I was not told in advance. I got a terse note. Meet me at the headquarters at 9. I felt all the things that happen when you are about to be exposed to a glare, vulnerability, exposure, and an odd adrenaline buzz of possibility. The room was full of cameras and lenses that felt like teeth. When Lan took the podium, he gave a short, precise speech. He said, "I have the means to expose those who traffic in lies. That woman beside me has rights and dignity I intend to protect." He didn't give me lines about our marriage being anything more than what it was supposed to be. He didn't perform possession. Then he did the thing that made the press buzz and my own heart involuntarily tilt. He used his real name in a way that the world could feel. "For the record," he said, and his voice filled the space, "my legal name is Landau. I also have responsibilities I do not take lightly. If anyone intends to leverage private matters against her, I will see to it that the truth and the law are on her side." It was a revelation not merely because of money, but because of the clarity of intent. He didn't brandish wealth as a cudgel, he used it like a flashlight. He exposed the machinery of influence being used to try to ruin me, and then turned that machinery toward accountability. Reporters asked questions. He answered with enough precision that the conversation shifted from rumor to those spreading rumor. The irony was that his public declaration made him part of the story in a way that protected me, but also made me feel oddly small and oddly held at once. Jim responded by calling me more names and by trying to create an impression of grievance. He filed counterclaims about reputation. The legal theater begins to feel like its own kind of rehearsal, with motions and statements like lines in a play. Lan's team countered with evidence, and when warranted, with threats of legal consequences for those who had knowingly spread falsehoods. The balance shifted because of that leverage, and because people who have reputations to protect do not like being associated with liars. At the same time, the fallout for Jim went beyond press statements. The officer who took my report followed up. There was an investigation into the hotel incident. Jim was arrested for a domestic assault charge when there was sufficient evidence, my witness statements, the officer's report, the messages. He was taken into custody for questioning. The arrest was not cinematic. It was bureaucratic, necessary, and, mercifully, visible. For months afterward there were hearings, and an order of protection was signed. The law did not undo the time we'd spent under the same roof, but it did draw a perimeter. It felt like a relief and a new kind of loneliness at once. Through all of this, people who mattered changed. My grandfather sat with me in the weeks that followed the arrest, and the ledger of shares that once felt like a countdown began to look more like a negotiation. My father called fewer times, and when he did, his voice was less clipped. He said one afternoon, "We will honor your place in the family. We'll find a way to make it right." He didn't say the words perfectly. He didn't do him any better than he was. But promises made by men who once spoke only to ledgers land heavier when they are earned. The theater gave me something steady in the months that followed. The role I had won ceased to be a small part and became, by necessity and by the belief of the director, a central piece in a production that would tour. Critics began to notice in paragraphs that felt like the work I had done had finally met an audience that could see it. My hands, once photographs for jewelers, became instruments of gesture that helped tell a story. I found that when I walked on stage, the world narrowed to task and craft. The applause at the end of a strong scene is its own kind of currency. It doesn't erase fear, but it clarifies purpose. Throughout this, my pregnancy continued, a private timeline ticking along against legal appointments and rehearsals. I had people around me, medical staff who treated me with professionalism, friends who brought soup and old movies, Lan who bought me a ridiculous resilient winter coat because he said I never liked the cold. There were scans and careful conversations. There were moments of a kind of ordinary happiness, a small sofa in a rented apartment where a sweater would be folded, and a future tentatively planned. There were also practical conversations about the kind of privacy I wanted and how to keep certain aspects of the pregnancy out of the tabloids. I decided quietly and absolutely that I would keep this child. I told my grandfather in a voice that refused bargaining. He wept when I told him, with a small sound of relief and something like joy. My father later, grounded in the ledger that had been his religion, found a phrase to say, "We will find a way to honor you." It was not perfect, but it was enough to start. Jim's attempts at coercion turned, after the arrest, into other maneuvers. He sought court options and tried to garner sympathy. He attempted to paint me as opportunistic in filings designed to embarrass. The legal teams argued and maneuvered. The details of legal wrangling are forever boring on one side and terrifying on the other. It was enough to say that the law, flawed, slow, imperfect, provided outcomes rather than theatrical closure. He faced consequences for the assault and threats. A judge issued restrictions. There was a criminal process that, when it ended, left him with a conviction that would be a ticket he could not easily expunge. I did not celebrate that as a victory. I recognized it as a necessary step toward safety. Lan's role evolved in ways that surprised both of us. The contract that had started as a shield became, over months, a place where small confidences accumulated. He would wait at the back of an empty theater, sometimes just to be present. He would call to check on rehearsal notes because he liked to hear how my work was going, not because he wanted a report. He introduced me slowly to people who mattered to him. A cousin who ran a small gallery, the woman who handled his charitable foundation. He was careful not to overstep the boundaries the contract had specified, but there was an honesty to his attentions that made me think he was trying, in his own way, to be seen by me fully, not merely to be useful. The pregnancy timeline compressed in ways the headlines couldn't understand. The point of fact that I was 25 days along made for a technical argument in family meetings about paternity. What mattered to me was not the identity alone, but the child who would owe me nothing but love. I didn't trust Jim, and hadn't for some time. I trusted the person who had stood next to me at a podium and used his name and resources to make sure my accusations were taken seriously. I trusted my own decisions. Those things together shaped the future I was building. There were setbacks. A paparazzi photo once found its way into circulation, a grainy shot of me leaving a hospital with a handbag, exercises later showing up as hints that something dramatic was afoot. The tabloids love a narrative. For a day or two, our lives were fodder for strangers. Then evidence surfaced that indicated the origin of many of the leaks. A PR firm that had been paid to muddy the waters on behalf of a client. Lon's team discovered payments. It was not a moral victory to have dirt scraped off a name. It was simply justice being done where it could be. My theater run became a tour. We traveled through cities that had their own rhythms. I learned to live in hotel rooms and to carry with me the small rituals that kept me stable. A mug from home, a photograph of my grandfather's bonsai, my lines written on paper I could smooth in my palm. The audience's applause began to stitch me into a professional identity that had little to do with other people's assumptions about me. Critics wrote that I breathed life into the role. I learned to let praise land and then move on. It was practice in not letting the praise or the pain make me smaller or larger than I knew myself to be. Lan, for his part, continued to be Lan. He kept his private life private, but he also began to be public about protecting the people he cared about in ways that did not erase their agency. When a tabloid tried to publish a speculative piece about our arrangement, his legal team sued for defamation. The lawsuit read like a statement, "You cannot weaponize rumors." It was the language of someone who had resources and knew how to use them to make an argument in law rather than in barroom conversation. We grew closer in the right-to-right moments, at midnight rehearsals when run-throughs had gone bad, and we shared silent coffee, in the early morning when the city smelled like bread and rain, in the way he listened when I talked about my grandfather's bonsai and how it needed a winter trim. He also made mistakes, moments where his protectiveness felt like a suggestion I should accept rather than an option, and when he did, he learned. The difference between control and care, again, mattered to both of us. It made his affection look less like conquest and more like partnership. As the pregnancy progressed, I found a stillness sometimes, a quiet with the child that had nothing to do with contracts or headlines. I would press my palm to my belly and imagine a small life that would inherit not ledgers, but the smell of rehearsal rooms and the sound of applause. This was an image that belonged to me wholly. I began to plan for a future that was not only a negotiation. A nursery painted a color I loved, a name that belonged to no ledger, and a life that included work I loved. When the time came to decide on formalities beyond our contract, Lan and I sat across from each other in his office that smelled faintly of old books and something like citrus. "I never wanted to be the thing that bought you out of trouble," he said. "I wanted to be the man who stood when you asked for help." "I didn't marry you for money," I said. "I married you because you put yourself between me and harm, and because you listened when I said what I wanted." He blinked, and the smallness of his expression made me realize he'd been working his way toward this for months. He told me he wanted our future to be not merely something written in legalese, but something lived. "I would like that," he said, "if that's what you want too." There are moments when privacy and public life collide, and the heart must decide whether to be swayed by the applause or by the person across the table. I chose the person. We agreed to begin proceedings to make our marriage real in the way that mattered to us, not as a rescue but as a mutual decision. We told no one at first. We planned a small ceremony, informal, private, in my grandfather's garden, because it felt like the only place that had ever watched my life without calculating it as currency. He said he would like that, and he asked my grandfather's blessing in a way that made my grandfather laugh and wipe his eyes at the same time. The weeks that followed the private wedding were not a fairy tale montage. There were sobering conversations about parenting, legal responsibilities, and the reality of being two people from different cultures of power trying to build a shared life. We hired a counselor for the transition because blending lives, especially under public scrutiny, requires work and intention. There were fights we had to learn how to have without anyone else getting to score points off them in a magazine. We learned that saying sorry matters and that being held by someone who knows you are flawed does not diminish you. Publicly, the narrative changed. Slowly, the press had their moment. Then stories moved on. New scandals replace old ones with a veracity that is, in the end, good for the exhausted. I returned to the stage, then to the tour, then to the city where my grandfather kept the bonsai bench. We found, amid the ordinary days, a routine that felt like home. Theater schedules, doctor appointments, late-night conversations about what we would tell our child when they asked where they came from. When the child was born, months after the courthouse stamp that had ended my previous marriage, the day felt like the first line of a new script. I held my child and felt my hands remember the work for which they were made, to cradle and to create. There were moments of fear, how to be a parent without the shadow of the past, but there were also 1,000 small decisions that we made together. Who would take the late-night shift, which school philosophies we favored, and what traditions from our families we would keep. My father came to the hospital, and when he held the baby there was a complex looseness in him that had been absent before. He apologized in ways clumsy and insufficient, but he apologized nonetheless. My grandfather, who had hidden small coins in my pockets when I was a child, wept with a sound that was half laugh. The shares my grandfather had once held like a countdown were transferred in a way that honored his desire for continuity, while respecting the life I'd chosen. It wasn't a narrative of triumph. It was an arrangement that required compromise on all sides, but it felt like settlement rather than surrender. Jim, in the end, faced consequences that shielded me bureaucratically and criminally. He also faced the hard work of correction that the system rarely makes easy. Part of me felt bad for the unfinished shapes of what we had once been, and part of me recognized that not all endings are fair. The law did not write a love story for him. The law did, however, make my path less dangerous. Lon stayed at my side through the first bewildering weeks of parenthood with a tenderness I had not expected. He still wore his reserve like a coat, but he also held my hand in ways that looked like practice at being a family. He never claimed the child's agency as if it were a chattel. He declared his devotion in ways that let me keep mine. He apologized when he overstepped, and he listened when I needed him to. Professionally, I kept working. The theater tour introduced our child to cities in an early, surreal chapter of life that felt like broadcasting a private life into public spaces. We learned to travel with a baby, to find childcare that respected my profession, to perform at night and read stories at dawn. The applause did not stop being precious, but its meaning shifted. It was no longer a landmark of my survival. It was one of the ways I lived. When people ask me now, years later, why I married a billionaire, I tell them two things. First, I left an unsafe marriage and I made choices to protect a future that belonged to me, my career, my dignity, my motherhood. Second, Lan was not a plot fix. He was a person who stood where he promised to stand and who learned to be a partner in a way that amplified my choices rather than replacing them. Wealth gave him the means to accelerate accountability, and he used those means to make space for me to be myself, not to own my story. It's an important distinction. His money did not make me brave. I had already left. His presence made certain kinds of danger less likely, and for that I am grateful. But gratitude is not the same as dependence. Where I had once been small because my silence was convenient for someone else, now I am not small. I am a woman who has been hurt and who did not let those hurts define her completely. There are days I still feel the old loneliness. There are nights when the weight of the choices sits like a second skin. There are days when headlines make me tired. But then my child's laugh cuts through the noise and I remember what I walked toward. I remember the courthouse stamp I keep in my wallet, a relic of the moment I chose my freedom. I remember the sickening flush of humiliation in that bar, and the pragmatic bargain that became a partnership. I remember the hand on the hotel room door that made me call the police, and the officer who listened and made a report. I remember the press conference where Lon used his name and his voice to make the world listen. I remember the theater applause that stitched me back together. If you had told me, on that day I left, that I would marry a man who carried a name the world recognized, I probably would have laughed in disbelief. I had been smaller then. I had allowed myself to be eroded. Walking away taught me how much I could carry. Choosing Lan, finally, truly choosing him, was not about buying back what I'd lost. It was about accepting an offered hand that respected my right to take it. Sometimes people frame my story as either a triumph of escape or a fairy tale rescue. It is neither one thing nor the other. It is a messy, ongoing life where protection and agency coexist uneasily and beautifully. I am not safer because someone paid bills or bought lawyers. I am safer because I take steps to protect myself, because I build supportive systems, because I accept help from people who do not try to own me. The Billionaire label is shorthand for resources that, when used responsibly, can restore safety. But safety is the result of choices, boundaries, and the willingness to ask for help. If you want the short, sensational version, my ex-husband cheated, I left, I remarried, and now my life is an op-ed headline. If you want the long version, I left because my silence was not an offering I wanted to give anymore. I married a man who had power but who learned to respect my agency. I had a child who is not a ledger entry but a person who knows something of resilience. I returned to the stage and learned that my hands can build and hold in ways that make me proud. I fought for safety and for a future where my child might grow up free of fear. There are days when gratitude and grief sit side by side. There are days when I stand backstage and think about the woman who left a quiet house because being small had begun to feel like death. There are days when I sit with my child and watch the sunlight hit their small fingers, and I am filled with a version of hope that is both tender and fierce. That is the story under the headline. If you're still here with me, if this story has landed somewhere in your chest, thank you for listening. If it helped you in any measure, if it made you consider the difference between rescue and partnership, between protection and possession, then tell someone who needs to hear it. There are more pieces to life than the loud ones. Sometimes the quiet decisions are the ones that save us. If you want to follow what happened after the wedding, none of it tidy, most of it beautiful, watch the next episode. Subscribe if you like, to hear the updates as we make this life together. For now, I will fold the ultrasound into a new place in my wallet and keep walking forward.